Hello and welcome to today's December 9th. And this is a meeting of the Governmental Accounting Standards Board with our Taxonomy Consultative Group. Very excited to have all of you here in Norwalk. I'm Joel Black. I'm the chair of the board at the GASB. And as a board, we're very much looking forward to hearing thoughts that all of you have on the taxonomy project, the Voluntary Digital Financial Reporting project that we're working on. It's a very important project to us. And all of you volunteering your time to participate with us and provide input throughout the year, as well as at this meeting today, is very much appreciated. I know that you all have plenty of things to do that don't include being here, traveling here, and coming here and spending time with us, but we appreciate that you're willing to do so. It's very important and valuable to us. So we're very much looking forward to the next couple of hours. And with that, for introductions, et cetera, I'll turn it over to our leader of the Taxonomy Consultative Group, Paulina. Take it away.
Thank you, Joel. Good afternoon, everyone. And again, echoing Joel's sentiment, thank you so much for a great morning and a great discussion. Please continue. So the housekeeping item reminders, when you speak, please ensure that you click the green button for the microphone and face the microphone. This is a public meeting, as you heard, is recording and it's being broadcasted. So to be able for people to hear you, you're going to have to talk to the mic. Second, as I mentioned this morning, I am going to pose the discussion questions and call you out. It's perfectly fine to say I don't have any comment, just to be mindful of that. Board members, if you have any questions, please put your tent up so I'll be able to know that you need to ask a question anywhere. And with that, we're going to start introductions. So I'm going to start and go around the room and then we can start the conversation. Paulina Haro, GASB staff.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cara Gianna. I am GASB staff.
Roberta Reese, GASB staff.
Liz Sweeney, President, Nutshell Associates.
Yossi Newman, Professor of Accounting, Touro University.
Jackie Reck, GASB member.
Lauren Stamey, I'm a director at Forvis Mazars.
Matt Harvey, State Farm.
Abhishek Lodha, Assured Guarantee.
Chris Martin, State of Georgia Controller's Office.
Good afternoon, Carolyn Smith, GASB staff, GASB board.
Stephanie Leiser, Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan.
Hi, Campbell Pride, Experial US.
Xue Yang, Bloomberg.
Alan Skelton, GASB staff.
Joel Black, again.
Carl I. Holzer, Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board.
Bob Hinkle, Chief Deputy Auditor for the State of Ohio.
Hi, I'm Ember Strange, and I'm the CFO for the City of North Little Rock, Arkansas.
Jeff Praviti, GASB Vice Chair.
Diane Ray, GASB member.
Truett Nguyen, DPC Data.
Hollis Hanson Pollock, Senior Manager at Crow.
Louis Mathern, FASB staff.
Good afternoon, Robert Scott, GASB member.
Hello, I'm Mark Gasway. I'm the Finance Director for Clark County, Washington.
Good afternoon, Christian Shabowski, GASB staff.
Tammy Waymeyer, GASB staff.
Miho Saito, GASB staff.
Thank you, everyone. So with that, we're going to start our topics of conversation. I'm going to tee up the topics fairly quickly, and then we're going to maximize the time that the TCG members have to communicate with the board your feedback. So the first topic for our first topic for conversation today is about the early discussions we had in our first meeting, which is basically the structural design of the taxonomy and how we incorporated the financial reporting model requirements and the financial reporting entity requirements into the taxonomy model. The major issue we were trying to resolve is the industry concerns that were raised and whether we can resolve the industry issues with a single taxonomy. And as you know, the reporting requirements in Statement 34 essentially provides the framework to address it by providing a single set of statements of government-wide statements and then permutating through the fund financials and combining them with special purpose reporting framework to be able to address all those reporting requirements. And so a state, a university, a utility can report under the same framework, just simply utilizing the different components that exist in the financial reporting framework. The industry tools that we use to solve the industry concerns were the structure of a single taxonomy based on the reporting requirements of Statement 34. And we are working towards the development of the line item flexibility, as you have seen in our prior discussions. This is a very high-level example of the taxonomy structure and model that you have seen in the past. The statement, government-wide statement of revenues, expenditures, and changes in fund balance. So as you can see, you have the line items at the left, which was all the conversation we had this morning. And here, clearly, all you have is the elements of financial statements, really not line items. They have not been populated. And at the far right side, you see the columns that are necessary to do major fund financial reporting and non-major financial reporting, and then the totals. So this is how we permutated essentially that set of the structure. With that, like I mentioned, I'm going to pose one question at a time, and I'm going to call you, each one of you, as we go through the feedback. The question number one is, what feedback do you have about the structural design of the GASB GAP taxonomy? And in this case, we're going to start this way. So, oh, sorry, we forgot to introduce the virtual people. We have two virtual people. So before we start the conversation, Dean, would you mind introducing yourself and answering the first discussion question, please? You got the lucky straw.
The foundation. This is a bigger question to unpack. I guess I would. I'm going to explore this one. This is a big question. Ask in a book, other than saying having important
Dean, we're having a lot of audio issues. I'm so sorry. Yeah.
Is this any better?
It looks
No.
so. Yes, I think so. Yes.
I think the structural design is really there's the structural design that we're talking about. One is the technique. Produce some more documentation that shows how to relate the technical structure, which we have a lot of experience with, the conceptual model, which your domain experts require based on their experience. So that extra documentation, I think, would make the design easier to learn. And so that I'm going to stay with that. I'll stop there.
Thank you. John?
Afternoon, John Ng, KPMG. So as it relates to the first question, I believe that the design makes sense as allowing the flexibility and modularity will allow governments, regardless of if they're a general purpose government or a special purpose government, to incorporate their own specific financial statement captions within the confines of the taxonomy. So definitely agree that this makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Liz?
So I generally like the approach that you're taking to the design here. I agree that taxonomies are generally pretty big umbrellas that can cover a lot of different types of reporting under the same accounting framework. So I am very comfortable that all the GASB entities will be able to report under the taxonomy. And I like the approach to being able to handle the unique way that GASB entities report, fund reporting, for example, I think is well handled with the approach. Just echo some of Dean's thoughts about it. Still haven't seen yet how the model will relate some of these items to each other, the rules of construction. So we haven't seen that yet, but I think we'll get to that, and I'm very comfortable with, with where we're at and the way you're laying it out.
Thank you, Yossi.
I think I'm going to start sounding a little repetitive to what Liz had to say. I think the concept, I think you guys are off to a really good start. I don't see any issue whatsoever in terms of one taxonomy addressing multiple types of governments, multiple areas of the standards. I do think personally I learned by kind of touching and feeling and playing with it. And so having real examples that we can kind of see how this theory is starting to take shape and action would be very helpful, and we'll get there when appropriate.
Lauren?
Yep, that's what I was going to say too about examples. I think that my clients, whenever you leave them a comment, can we see an example? Can we see an example? And so I think that would be extremely helpful to have an example.
Thank you. Matt?
So I say this as someone who only learned what a taxonomy was when I was invited to join this group. But from what I can tell, I think this makes a lot of sense, and I like the direction it's going.
Thank you, Abhishek.
Yeah, most of it is covered. The one thing that I do want to highlight, which is important from a technology standpoint, is the metadata that you associate with this taxonomy. Like, the more available, the better it is, so that the data can be exposed and extracted in the right format for consumers.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, I also appreciate the flexibility that's in there. So being able to give consistencies to those that are users of my data, but then allow for some government specific items to be taken into consideration. So
thank you, Stephanie.
Also, speaking as someone who will be a consumer of the data, I think the direction looks great so far. I think one thing I would emphasize is I like the modularity. I think it kind of balances the ability to holistically capture what's going on in a single taxonomy while providing the flexibility. And then that will work well for us from a data consumption standpoint.
Thank you, Campbell.
Okay, question one. So on this design of the taxonomy, we talked about being detailed. I think it's important to have a lot of these concepts in there as much as you can. We didn't really talk about it, but I think it's important to really define things clearly on what they are. I know there's probably it's a little bit up in the air relative to in terms of modified accounting versus accrual accounting. I think we talked about dimensions in the past. I think it would be better to have those as concepts. I think they're distinct things. I don't know if we've got to that point yet. And then on the extensions, it looks like a decision's been made. I'm not sure if this is set in concrete or not, whether filers would actually create their own extensions or they're doing everything in the data file they submit. I think you should look at that very closely. There seems to be a few things, just if you look at the potential challenges, is the approach that's being taken is a little bit different than what's being taken with the FASB taxonomy. I think it would be good to keep those as consistent as possible in terms of the approach, just so that you've got, if you want to use the same tools, the same software, the same expertise, you've got that available. So that's something I think you really want to consider. And do I believe taxonomy will sufficiently address the industry concerns? I think it will. I think there's going to be a lot of communications required and a lot of training and a lot of help with people to actually understand that. So the more information that can be put in the taxonomy, the more self-explaining the taxonomy can be. I think that would be useful. We kind of talked about this thing with the extensions rather than just saying this is an anchor. I would like to see more granularity there, because I think that's going to create confusion for people. But I think we're on the right path. I think it's important, really, and there's a lot of work in just defining what all the concepts are. So continuing to do that, I think, is going to be really important. So sorry I took so long.
So a couple clarifications, just if you don't mind. We are only in question number 1. And just for reference, otherwise everybody's going to start answering the 3 questions and then we will let the meeting run away. And also, when we develop projects, nothing really gets set on stone until the end. And so this is just where we are today. There's the feedback welcome to be able to continue to think about the issue. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I think the overall structure looks good. Using one taxonomy for all governments with those vertical components is practical and less complex. I think with clear guidance on the modularities and clusters, the preparers should be fine with it.
Thank you, Carl.
I'm going to take the out and say no comment.
Thank you. Robert?
Yeah. So the structural design, I think it is a very appropriate. The flexibility that's built into it, I think of those the size, the difference in size, complexity of governments in Ohio. I think that the structure as designed will work well for both large and small, for special purpose or general governments.
Thank you, Amber.
I basically agree with everything that Bob has said about the different types of entities working in many different types. I don't see any challenges with the structure.
Hi, speaking on behalf of the data vendor who actually is in the business of collecting financial data from PDF reports and digitizing it, and for our end users. We are very encouraged by this initiative from the board, and I think it is a step in the right direction. And even though many details probably still need to be worked out, but I think you can look at it as a kind of a wholesale user of this data, and I think our industry needs all the help it can get in terms of for the data transparency.
I'm supportive of developing a single taxonomy. I think it's appropriate that it mirrors the current financial reporting model and that you don't accidentally create new financial reporting models in the development of a taxonomy.
I basically agree with what everyone said, particularly what Hollis just said. I'm very thankful that this doesn't create some new methodology or new standard out there. I agree with the conceptual framework, makes sense to me, the structural design. And I think it allows for good flexibility.
I'm generally supportive of the design framework. Like to see more as time passes. I think there are going to be some modeling challenges, but that's question number 2. So,
thank you, Mark.
As a preparer of financial statements, I believe that the current structure will allow us to get the results which is desired within our existing financial statements without having to make changes and without having to create more work. So.
Thank you. Chris, sorry I skipped introducing you. So do you have a minute?
Is that me, Chris Polina?
Yes, you.
Okay. Chris Knight, GASB member. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So question number 2, what feedback do you have about the potential challenges with the designed approach taken? Mark, you start again.
I think there are significant challenges based on the different types of government. I think the governments come in all sizes. And I think that this is going to be challenging for particularly small governments. If you think of the majority of the governments that exist, small governments are going to have a hard time implementing this regardless. Those that are a little larger that have resources will be able to probably take this on without too many challenges. But I think there are some significant challenges involved. So.
Thank you, Louis.
On a more technical level, I'm first concerned that you're trying to avoid extension taxonomies. I appreciate the thinking there, but at the end of the day, you've got enough diversity in reporting that I think it's going to be really difficult to constrain the modeling to your base taxonomy without extensions. And built on top of that, the way you've implemented anchoring, from what I've seen so far, is a little confusing to me. One, I don't think you can tell whether you're anchoring from wider to narrow or narrower to wider in the implementation. The relationships aren't conveying that. And it's also sort of just kind of constraining in terms of what you can anchor to. The idea of anchoring is you should be able to kind of like anchor to whatever the relevant concept is. So those are the, the first things that come to mind for me.
Thank you. Thank you, Hollis.
I foresee challenges with ensuring that the data is all correctly mapped to the reporting units and the basis of accounting. Just because that's, a complexity that as humans, we're used to reading. Like we all know what a statement of activities looks like. We know to look to the left-hand column for the expenses, but to actually operationalize digitizing that, I think may be challenging.
Thank you, Triet.
Yes, I see a potential challenge in fact, in the voluntary nature of this initiative. And what I appreciate the board said, intent, it has the potential of creating kind of two classes of the haves and have-nots in terms of our market, right? And at the time where smaller issuers, need a lot more exposure to investors, and we need to bear in mind that we have to make it easy as possible for that particular class of issuers to implement this initiative, because otherwise, I think the market will probably not benefit from much more from New York City having better disclosure. It's probably more in Elgin, Illinois, that would benefit from this kind of effort.
Thank you.
The challenges I see are more so with educating the preparers on the design and the taxonomy in itself, because accountants think one way, they pretty much think black and white, and not really seeing a taxonomy before this group. There's a lot that I think if there's some kind of basis that they understand the terminology like modules and, taxonomy and just the different things that go into this, because it's voluntary, I think if we give that effort up front, it will be more widely accepted.
Thank you, Robert.
Yeah, so going back to a little bit about what Mark said, I'm concerned about the challenges this would create for the small governments, and in the voluntary nature of it, that they would maybe just choose to not participate. And then the other area would be the government specific options that are included, and that we see too often in Ohio that those governments think that their item is outside of just regular reporting, so that there may be a move to create accounts line items within that option that is unnecessary.
Thank you. Carl?
Yeah, just speaking as someone who's coming to the taxonomy new, I do think the education component is going to be a major part of making it successful.
Thank you. Shoop?
The challenge I see is that the one taxonomy, it could become large and harder to navigate through, given the size of the number of the elements to choose, especially during the early adoption stage. So I think maybe the clear guideline on what modules and clusters and vertical components are, together with the side-by-side example, will be very important.
Thank you. Campbell?
Okay, question 2 this time.
You can say it.
So just on the challenges, what Lewis had said about the extension taxonomies, I know the reason you've made the path you've done. I think it would be worthwhile as part of the design to reconsider that. I'm not sure that's not set in stone, but one of the things to remember too is with things like AI, the ability to create a lot of this stuff is going to be significantly easier than it has been. So I wouldn't worry about potential challenges because some of those challenges are going to be solved. So just keep an eye out on what's actually happening in the marketplace, because that may influence the design approach. And I wouldn't let the design approach be driven by perceived shortfalls in software potentially. I think it should be try and keep the model as clean as possible and try and capture all the information that you can.
Thank you. Stephanie?
I would agree with others. I think the devil's in the details on this, and there's always going to be a tension between balancing flexibility with the potential benefits of standardization. And so I would just I would echo what Triet and others have mentioned, which is I think the process is especially important for this because there are so many diverse stakeholders, and we don't. I mean, I think we're still trying to understand all of these perspectives and kind of where everyone is coming from, and then how does that translate into thinking through the costs and benefits of each little design decision that's going to be made.
Thank you, Chris. Martin?
Thank you. I think this is just going to be such a new concept for many issuers of statements that we've not done anything like this before. When we do other GASB statements, we go, oh, this is similar to this. I can take kind of things I've learned from other implementations, and this is just so different. So I think just don't underestimate just educating and getting people to understand what it is we're asking them to do and seeing it. You mentioned earlier about people being visual. I think seeing it would be helpful. And clearly documenting and laying out how things will be tagged will be very important. Because if you're going to leave it up to them to make interpretations about some things, I think that's where you could get into kind of a scarier area of not having as good of quality of data.
Thank you. Abhishek?
I'd like to echo the same thing about education on both sides, issuers as well as the investors or the consumers of this data. In addition to education, it's also like a question of workflow, right? Like how do you build the right platforms that help make it easier for issuers or preparers to disseminate this information or prepare this information, as well as consumers to access this information. And again, from a consumer standpoint, it's like, okay, if you create a taxonomy of 3,000 line items, I'm not saying that's the number, but if you do it and it becomes cumbersome for me to write those queries and maintain the data as it's evolving, becomes challenging. So how do you, again, simplify the process on both sides so that, it solves the true problem of making this information more accessible?
Thank you, Matt.
I'd echo the concerns that Lisa shared, just in terms of being able to strike the right balance between, it being prescriptive and specific enough to be useful to the user community, while also allowing enough flexibility in generality that it's not impossible for the issuers and the preparers to implement.
Thank you, Lauren.
I agree that the flexibility in the line items is going to be challenging. I just thinking about like whenever I onboard new clients, or something as easy as like accrued payroll, like, right, that sounds super easy, but is that accounts payable? Is that other liabilities? Or do we make a whole new line item and call it accrued payroll? So just simple nuances like that, I think, are going to be challenging.
Thank you, Liz. Yossi.
Yeah, I'll echo Lewis and Campbell. I've always been a fan of extensions. I recognize several people in the room have highlighted the issue of doing things differently and where the flexibility could be a downside. But the one thing about extensions and XBRL is they kind of self-identify, and so to focus in on that. And if it's an issue, they can often be addressed quickly. And so I think from a technical perspective, as Campbell had highlighted, to keep that an open mind toward our approach toward extensions.
Thank you, Liz.
So I think one of the bigger challenges that the board will be grappling with will be just the balance between how big, granular is the taxonomy going to be, which can offer a lot of benefits for users, versus trying to make it confined enough so that it isn't overly intimidating. You want to encourage adoption, right? So what's good enough day one, right, to start with, and recognizing that the first iteration isn't the final and that complexities can be added later. But I think that will be one of the challenges. And I think there's a few places that the board can look for learnings from other areas other folks who have grappled with these issues. And so, of course, stakeholder feedback will be great in that regard. But also the FASB has learnings from many years of their adoptions. And there are other governmental adoptions around the world that also, I'm sure, have grappled with these issues. So there's a few places that the board can look for some guidance on that issue.
Thank you very much. So discussion question number 3. Oh, I'm sorry. I keep forgetting the virtual people. My apologies. So John?
Yeah, so I echo a lot of the commentary that was already made. I mean, I think education is really important with the flexibility and modularity and incorporating both general purpose governments and special purpose governments. I think education, just to make sure in practice this is happening as be seeing the taxonomy working will go a long way. I can see some issues in terms of tagging and whatnot, especially with government specific items in the sense of anchoring. So definitely something that needs to be addressed as we think through practice and the cost benefit of it.
Thank you. Dean?
Echoing Liz, Campbell, Lewis, and others, I think there are 2 design challenges for the taxonomist and 1 mental challenge for all of us. Regarding the design challenges for the taxonomist, 1 is building for extensibility. We don't want 15,000 prescriptive elements, so we do need extensibility, and anchoring is 1 method. I guess I would suggest people look at XBRL US, who has done some good work here for the FASB taxonomy. The second taxonomy challenge is that some of these topics may appear in different reports sections, so perhaps considering distinguishing the modeling of this codification of the standards as separate from modeling the reports, and that's one consideration. And last is the challenge of making we might do our work differently if we had a really good taxonomy. Our imagination is limited by experience, and things like our experience is limited by our spreadsheet. So I would suggest that we have to think about what the work could look like rather than trying to fit the work into the we've been using for 20 years.
Thank you. So discussion question number 3. Do you believe the structure of the taxonomy sufficiently addressed the industry concerns? And this time I'm going to call it out on random. So Carl?
No comment.
Mark?
So as a preparer, I'm not as familiar with what the industry concerns are. So I guess I don't have any comment on this either. So
Thank you. Hollis?
Yes, I think that the structure of the taxonomy would address the various flexibility needed from different types of governments.
Matt?
Yes, from what I can tell from what's been presented so far, I think this does address the concerns that I have that would need to be addressed.
Thank you. Stephanie?
I don't have anything to add.
No comments.
Thank you. Lewis?
Nothing to add.
Chris Martins?
Yeah, don't have any feedback on
Yossi? Sorry. Thank you. Yossi?
I guess I'll take it from a teaching and research perspective. I think it has the potential to be very helpful. And again, I'd go back to what I said earlier. I look forward to actually, getting to examples that I can test out.
Thank you. John?
Yes, from an auditor perspective and working on various different types of governments, I think the structure makes sense from a flexibility perspective. So, thank you.
Thank you. Triet?
I don't have anything to add.
Thank you. Dean?
My answer is perhaps. There's nothing more to add.
Thank you. Lauren?
Yeah, I have nothing further to add either.
Thank you. Ember?
I think that it does, but I just want to go back to reiterating that I think it will take some education because all governments think they're different from each other, and a wastewater utility thinks it's different than a city and a school and vice versa. So I do think that just teaching them on how they can use it. And from what I've heard from like the bond market industry, I do think it'll be very beneficial for what they use it for.
Liz?
So the industry concerns that I hear in talking to folks are around what does standardization mean, cost benefit, and entity identification. So Emma just alluded to the standardization issue, and when people say data standard, there's sometimes it elicits the perception that it means everybody has to report the same things, as opposed to you report what you report, but you describe it in a standard way. And I think there's still going to be a lot of education needed. So, like in direct answer to your question, I believe the structure of the taxonomy sufficiently addresses that issue, but there will be misperceptions about what it actually means. So I think there will still be ongoing education needs there. This morning, we talked a lot about cost versus benefit. And so we can have more discussion about it with the board president if there's, interest for that. And then on the entity identification side, when you read an audited financial statement, it often doesn't directly address a unique way to identify the entity. It might give a name. There are 31 Washington counties in America. There are 26 Jefferson counties in America. It often doesn't tell you which one. So just being able to use that data is going to necessitate the ability to identify entities, which, is like not, as far as I understand, not an accounting standard, but is still going to be necessary. So there may be a few other things like that are necessary in order to make the data usable, that aren't necessarily, part of the accounting specifications. But I think the board will need to address those at some point.
Thank you. Lisa? Thank you.
I'll pass.
Thank you. Campbell?
Okay, yeah, we've heard lots of industry concerns, so just go through those quickly. Will it accommodate my custom reporting? I think that's fine. What you showed us, I think the thing you may want to think about including is maybe some additional information which identifies that these elements are specific to a particular type of industry, like these are applicable to utilities or what other types of activities that government's undertaking, and classifying those might be helpful. So then people say, these are the only elements I need. So, or these that relate to my area. I think that would be helpful. There's lots of small entities, like really small entities. And so I think that the structure would support that. And I think in terms of being able to make it as standardized as possible, so they could just fill out a spreadsheet and it automatically creates their filings. So I think it generally supports that. And I think that's what's going to probably happen in the majority of cases anyway. The other thing we've heard is, let's have AI do all this. We don't really need standards. That's kind of another thing that industry's been saying as well. I think that's, to some extent, is actually true, but I think the taxonomy will actually create a framework in which AI can actually work within. So that is actually would be super helpful. So in terms of building the model, think about that. One of the things you may want to do is test it with AI and make sure that it can actually read it. And then the other thing we've heard is not everyone uses GASB standards. There's a lot of variation in the accounting. I think from what I've seen, when you boil down to it, a lot of the concepts are the same, particularly things like cash accounting. As long as you've got those types of things in there, that might be able to be used by people your entities that officially don't use GASB, but it probably has like the majority of the overlap in there anyway.
Thank you. Did I get everybody? So with that, anybody has? Jeff?
So I wanted to ask one thing before we leave this topic. It goes back to something you, Mark, answered to the second question, was talking about small governments and the difficulty that they might have. And of course, as a voluntary thing, of course, we would want the most uptake as we possibly can, including small governments. And I was wondering whether, and not to put you on the spot, but even just to think about it, or if others want to join in, like, is there something in the design choices thus far that's making it harder for governments? In other words, are there alternatives we could pursue that might make it easier on small governments? Or is it the fact that for small governments, a taxonomy at all is going to be difficult for them to do, no matter what it looks like? Is there something that we could control, or is it just that for certain small governments, a taxonomy at this point would just be too much for them?
There are a couple of reasons why I think small governments will struggle with this. One, I don't know that they have the resources to do something like this, or the technical capability. It just depends on how it's rolled out and the resources that are made available, whether it's a general tool that we're able to use. A lot of times, the smaller governments are limited in their in-house staffing. So it's certainly going to be a staffing issue for them. And, just the desire to do one more thing will be difficult. So all of the things you said.
Yeah, so it sounds more like we can't take on a taxonomy. It would be hard for us to take on a taxonomy, regardless of how it was. It's not the choices we've made, like, wow, that's making it harder for small governments than this alternative. It's just the step of going to a taxonomy may be too much for some small governments to take.
Yes, I agree with that. Yes.
Jeff, may I add something? We could turn it into a more positive scenario in the sense that, this may help put small issuers on an equal basis with the big guys, right? So that might be the carrot that we can present. Say, because right now I know a lot of investors just overlook small issues because they don't have the time to chase the kind of not well covered issuers. But if they can, if the data quality is such that they can be easily integrated into an analytical platform, then I think we can make that case that it actually may help their market access. So just kind of, this might be a positive spin we can put on this. Thank you.
Anyone else? So we will move on to topic number 2. So in here, the conversation is about the line items and all the conversations we've had about, you've seen the clusters of capital assets, you've seen a few things, and we discussed the anchoring this morning. We've talked about basis of accounting in the past. So all these topics for feedback to the board. As we've discussed in the past, the taxonomy defined line items will include classification by clusters of elements. So within, for example, assets, you would have cash and investments, you would have receivables, you have capital assets and things like that. And then within them, you have line items that are taxonomy defined. Each line item cluster includes details. Each line item includes a description of what that means and a codification reference. In addition to what the taxonomy provides in terms of line items, there's a government-specific component to it. So a government that does not find their specific line item could include their own item. And we've talked about how the structure of this model works. We've talked about the clusters and how they organize into this. Yossi suggested folders where you put line items. And then we talked this morning about how you apply them. So in the left, you see ABC government, and they are titled the blue line items to the taxonomy defined. And then the orange line items are government-specific line items. And as we discussed this morning, they will be anchored in the taxonomy. This is the application of how the taxonomy government-specific are shown. So as we discussed this morning, it has a label, has amount, and it has an anchor as the relationship to determine what this looks like. We have also discussed the basis of accounting, which is a very unique government, U.S. government issue. I don't believe there is another standard setting body that has this challenge where we present different bases of accounting in a single set of financial statements. And so at the moment, what we have approached this issue is to create the basis of accounting as a separate field dimension in taxonomy words. And so what this means is you would have a single element defined as revenue, as the left-hand side shows, with different numbers, but with a specific dimension that tells you whether it is reported in accrual and modified accrual or budgetary basis. The alternative is the right-hand side, where you see the basis of accounting as an attribute part of the line item. So revenue, accrual, revenue, modified accrual, or revenue, budgetary basis. So 3 line items that can be used in each set of the financial statements. Clearly, the taxonomy, we would control that where we place accrual, where we place modified accrual, where we place budgetary line items, regardless of which method it's approached. You would not go to the statement of net position and have the option to tie something as modified accrual. You will not go to the statement of revenues, expenditures, changes in fund balance, and be able to opt for accrual accounting. Those options simply will not be there, so we will be restricted to try to eliminate the error issue. So those are the broad topics for conversation. Again, I'm going to pose one question at a time. Question number 4 is, what feedback do you have about the line item approach taken in the taxonomy? Specifically, what feedback do you have about the approach of providing taxonomy-defined line items and permitting the inclusion of government-specific line items? So I am going to start to my left. Mark?
So in looking through what is currently being proposed, I particularly appreciate the ability to use what we're already preparing as financial statements, and they're working the taxonomy project around that. In other words, we're not going to have to change what we're doing. We just have to be able to adapt it to whatever taxonomy is selected. So the familiarity, the consistency of what we're already doing will be a big benefit for us in accomplishing the designs of the project. So,
thank you, Lisa.
Yes, the line item design makes sense to me. I have no issue with that. I don't know if we're at the point about talking about anchors. Is that later? Okay, then.
So because we didn't pose that specific question,
Yeah.
you can feel free to comment right now.
Oh, okay. I think that the flexibility that's provided, I think I mentioned before, I think it's a good thing, but I think it needs to be watched so that we don't have too much flexibility creep in. And then in terms of the anchoring of the specific line items, I had mentioned before, how the multiple to 1 or many to 1 works would be something I'm interested in knowing more about. And then the ability to create a field or a line item and not anchor it, I just would want to see how that works in practice.
Thank you. Louis?
I just want to comment on the basis of accounting. I like this concept. I've expressed that before. But I have material concerns about how it will work in practice. I know of no other XBRL taxonomy that puts the basis of accounting into a dimensional construct like this. And I think there's probably good reason for that. So I would just encourage you to study that very, very carefully before going forward with it to make sure that it actually works as intended, because we don't really know at this point. We don't really have good use cases out there that tell us that it works.
Thank you, Hollis.
I think for the line item design approach, it'll be really important that there's different levels that roll up consistently. So if a government presents, depreciable capital assets, not depreciable capital assets, but another government presents 6 rows, you could still compare those 2 governments by sort of rolling them up into the next line. So I think that will really be a key for comparability.
Thank you. Triet?
Yeah, we think the line item design approach that presents a pretty good blend of both standardization and flexibility. Now, are we answering question 5 or? it seems like Louis got into that, but.
Oh, sorry.
So I'll save my comments for that. Thank you.
I didn't realize I had jumped ahead. Sorry.
I was trying not to be mean again. Shreya, do you have any comments on question 4?
Yeah, I thought it just did. Yeah, but you mean, yeah. So question 5, I'll save my. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Amber?
I think that having flexibility is good on the inclusion of the government specific line items. I could see where that could end up causing some problems because I could see where a preparer, if they just didn't know where something went, they would throw it in and call it government specific when it really isn't. And, we use some very easy examples, like if they had an account called cash or a grouping called cash and then cash and bank. Well, cash and bank is not specific to their government. So I think it again goes back to, I think the option of having it is good, but there needs to be some information out there, like really think about whether what you're talking about is specific to your government, or are you just calling it something different when it's really not this. And so that's where I could see some issues. And one other thing is for an accountant, because I am a government preparer, I think that a lot of this really kind of lines up if we can make preparers think about when they get a new software, or if they're in an act for software, they have to go through this process of grouping all of their accounts. Now, they don't put their city name or their basis of accounting, but they have to go in and say, is it cash? Is it a receivable? Long-term, short-term. And so this process is a lot like that. And if we can communicate that to the preparers, I think they won't be as overwhelmed with what's a taxonomy and what are all these columns and things like that. Make it something they can relate to.
Thank you. Robert?
Yeah, I'm just going to echo what Amber had said, and my comments earlier is I think the government specific option is needed. However, my concern is that it could grow out of control.
Thank you. Carl?
Yeah, I don't think I have any specific feedback.
Thank you. Shu?
The approach makes sense. Standard line items ensure comparability, and the government-specific line items provides flexibility for any unique circumstances. So I think it's a good balance. And also the anchoring custom items to the closest standard taxonomy is very helpful for downstream users to do the mapping if they are properly used.
Thank you. Campbell?
Yeah, I think you absolutely need the ability for people to create their own line items in the financial statements and other places as well, because it's just going to be stuff you're not going to capture. At the same time, you probably want to think about what's the process that we can see if there's things that people are adding a lot of, and then analyze that and add maybe those back into the taxonomy over time. That's probably a process you should think about doing. And then in terms of the anchoring, I think the anchoring can be very helpful so that people actually understand what the data is. I don't necessarily agree with the anchoring approach we saw today, but I think the key is to have an anchor. That's the thing we should be talking about. And then, was the other part of this question? Yeah, and just generally, if to the concern about people just going crazy and creating extensions, I think that's something that you probably shouldn't worry about. That's probably something that whoever's collecting this data should worry about. From the terms of the model, if you're worried about that, that may make you do decisions that probably are not the best decisions.
Thank you. Stephanie?
I think the answer to the question is going to depend an awful lot on kind of the different applications and technologies that people are using to do the tagging. So for example, our group, we created a very simple tagging tool that's just a spreadsheet. And so you can use it without knowing what a taxonomy is. And it's just kind of drop down menus. And, you don't need to know that there's extensibility. You don't need to know really anything about there's this gigantic taxonomy with all of these options, which can feel overwhelming. And so I think, regardless of kind of how we come down on the various details, I think from a preparer standpoint and even from a data user standpoint, a lot of it is going to be kind of what happens in that moment of tagging and how user friendly is that process.
Thank you. Chris Martin.
Yeah, I mean, my goal would be to use as many of the taxonomy defined items as possible, to Ember's point. Like, if I call it cash in banks, but I might tag it to cash. But I do definitely see a need. I mean, I gave an example this morning where we will have government specific line items. So we definitely need to account for that like you guys have.
Thank you.
No, I think it all makes sense as it's defined, and it comes back to how software is developed for someone to actually tag it. And it's generally, hopefully, to a great extent, a one-time exercise, right? So that's where, again, education right out of the gate, heavy on that, so that, the first time or the second time people are tagging their financials, it's a lot easier. And then hopefully it gets more streamlined as we go forward.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, I would say I like the approach that's being taken. I do think that having the taxonomy define line items and allowing the government specifics strikes the right balance between, again, trying to have that specificity and allowing the flexibility. I would say I share the concerns that Ember talked about in terms of, and I guess this is just from things that I've seen and heard in my prior experience on GASAC. If you have a line item that doesn't exactly line up with the taxonomy as it's defined, I could see a lot of defaulting to I need to create my own because it doesn't line up exactly. And if we start, I don't know that you're going to know that you see that until you actually roll this out and try it. From a user perspective, again, when I think about how I'm going to use this, it might be in the context of a model that is going to compare across entities within a sector. And then if I start to see a lot of items that I would expect to see that kind of default to other within a category, then that's going to reduce some of the specificity I think that I would be looking for.
Definitely appreciate that. And I think in one of our conversations, we had given an example. We totally expect and anticipate that. The one that we were teasing was, what's the difference between due from primary government and receivable from primary government? There really isn't. But if we don't tell the preparer that, they're going to think, oh, they only put receivable from primary government. I'm going to put that in my taxonomy specific. We were working through the asset cluster, and the word advance is everywhere. And it's like, what do you do with advance? I'm not quite sure. So there is definitely that ambiguity that exists today with the duality of the meanings that we have to work through.
So I think the only thing additional that I have to add is the auditor and researcher in me loves the codification references within the defined line items. I think that'll be really great. When people ask for like examples, they'll hopefully be able to pull up their own example. And so I think that's a nice touch.
Thank you. Yossi?
Yeah, I think this approach is indispensable. I think from my perspective, at least if done properly, extensions are a feature, not a bug. And I think some of the things, particularly the example you just gave, when you add anchoring into it, if someone went and decided that receivable from PG was somehow different than due from PG, they'd probably anchor it now, or if we'd be pushing the anchors, that would be an immediate flag for you to take a look at it and get back to them, let them know either they're right and we edit it to the taxonomy, or they're wrong and they do it differently next time.
Thank you. Liz?
So I generally like the approach you're taking to the line items. If I understand correctly, it seems like you're trying to provide enough specific line items to avoid the use of generalized, other revenues, other asset type of fields, which I think is good. And then there's been a lot of comment that I completely agree with about the creation and use of government specific line items. I really like the anchoring approach. I think it's a very elegant way for data on the data analytics side to be able to associate something with another cluster of assets or revenues, et cetera, or not, right? But I think just having the anchoring approach there is really helpful. Right now, you're thinking of making it optional, and there will be preparers who will see that it's optional and just leave it blank because it's optional. And so I think, that'll be something for the board to weigh. And it may be one of those things. And I'm not stating an opinion about it, but it may be one of those things that, in the first round, right, it sort of meets the good enough standard to encourage adoption. But it will be at some point something that the board will want to think about is the optionality there.
Thank you. John?
So yeah, I think conceptually it makes sense in terms of the approach here. I echo a lot of the sentiment in the room as it relates to practicality and how it's actually implemented via software or people tagging this, users or preparers, tagging this themselves. Can see a lot of issues with anchoring in terms of the meaningfulness of reports being generated. So it'll be interesting to see how this happens in practice as preparers are adopting.
Thank you. Dean?
Yeah, I like how the line item design approach, to echo others, definitely need extensions. We also need education so that folks can know that when extensions are use custom labels and use an existing standard element, and how the extensions that are well anchored. So education will be important, but extensions are necessary.
Thank you. Question number 5. What feedback do you have about the approach taken to incorporate the basis of accounting into the design of the taxonomy line items? So I'm going to start with Liz.
So conceptually, it makes sense to me that, the basis of accounting, it's unique to governments that certain line items are reported in one basis of accounting and other line items are in a different basis of accounting, and the user would want to know that. So it makes sense conceptually. There have been some comments about sort of how that gets implemented, which, I guess we'll give some thought to, but just conceptually, I think it makes sense to incorporate it.
Thank you. Josie?
Again, not to dismiss what we heard from Lewis before, but from putting on my governmental accounting hat, I think this duality is one of the things that's unique about GASB reporting, and I think very much needs to be effectively captured. This feels wonderful to me, but I recognize, as Campbell and Lewis have raised, there could be mechanical issues with it, so that maybe we need to look at this as well as other ways of doing it, but it feels indispensable.
Thank you. Lauren?
I think that kind of the feature that we talked about earlier to kind of lock it down. So like where on the statement of activities, you're not going to have the option to do the modified accrual. And then maybe if, someone is a business type activity, maybe they don't even have options at all. So I think that that'll be extremely helpful.
Thank you, Matt.
I think it makes a lot of sense, although I should say I say this as someone who's never taken an accounting class in his life and has only spent his career in muni, so I don't think there's anything unusual about having 2 different bases of accounting in the same financial statements. That said, I may be one of 17 people on the planet that think that way, so my opinion here might be worth just that.
Thank you. Abhishek?
Nothing further to add. I think that's an important data point for us to have.
Thank you. Chris? Martin?
Yeah, I think from a user's perspective, it's very doable. I do like what Lauren said about locking it down so that you can't pick the wrong basis of accounting, because if you're working on a general fund statement, you know what basis of accounting you're using. And I can see where it's absolutely needed for analyzing data, because my budgetary number versus my modified and full do not mean the same thing. So I think it is needed.
Thank you. Stephanie?
I would say, just kind of pulling a few things together, in a way, it's redundant. If you already know what statement you're looking at, you already know what the basis of accounting is. And so in that sense, I don't know if it hurts, but it doesn't really add anything to your analytical capability. But one additional thought, and I don't know if this is beyond the scope of what we're talking about, is being able to label the basis of accounting for information that's in the notes And, if you have like those level 3 numbers that are going to be tagged in the MD&A or in the notes or in another, outside of the face financial statements, that would be very helpful to have that.
So definitely things that we have talked about, and the basis of accounting ought to be defined for any monetary amount, but not any numerical amount. So, for example, the discount rate in the pensions, that's a numerical value, but does
But it won't
not
have
need a
a-
basis of accounting. So we're thinking through that. Campbell?
Yeah, you definitely need elements for modified accrual and for base and for the accrual and for the budgetary. I think you had the two options there. I'd prefer to see these as line items, purely for the reason because they're kind of different. You think they're different things, but they're kind of the same thing. They're really describing what revenue is. If I was to say to someone in the accounting area, I said, "Oh, this is revenue," and the first question they might ask is it modified or is it accrual? If they're asking that, then you probably need line items because things like we are dimensionalizing other stuff as well, like what period it's in and which business applies to, which fund it applies to. For those are kind of more contextual. This is this thing, and this is where we're applying it to. It's not like this is revenue and we're applying it to modified base of accounting. So I think it's the second option is my preference.
Thank you. Sure.
I think it's a simple approach, and the two-dimension format keeps the line items clean. As Stephanie mentioned, if you know what statement you are looking for, you already know the basis of accounting, so there's no issue with that.
Thank you. Carl?
Yeah, no, I don't think I have anything to add.
Robert?
Yeah, I think it's important, but I don't have anything additional than what's already been said.
Thank you, Amber.
Same for me.
Thank you. Triet?
Yes, putting my credit analyst hat on, I think it's very important that we have that data point.
Thank you. Hollis?
On the face of the financial statement, since the basis of accounting follows the statement, I would defer to the taxonomist for whether it would be better to do a separate field or part of the line item. I think the challenge will be more so in correctly associating the basis of accounting with any monetary values in the notes.
Thanks. Lewis?
I'll pass.
Thank you. Lisa?
It makes sense to me to include the basis of accounting.
Thank you. Mark?
Yeah, we've already incorporated into what we do as preparation, so I don't see it as an issue. So
Thank you. John?
So I echo what Hollis just said. I was thinking about the same thing. While I leave it up to the taxonomist to determine how you tag statements for basis of accounting, it'd be interesting to see how the basis of accounting plays out within the notes and monetary amounts.
Thank you. Dean?
I have nothing to add. Thank you.
Thank you. Question number 6. What feedback do you have about potential challenges with the design approach taken for line items? And this can be broadly construed as government-specific anchoring, or the basis of accounting as just discussed. So any new information that you would like to share? In this case, let me use my cheat sheet, sorry. Campbell?
Yeah, I pass.
Thank you. Shu?
I think many of us have mentioned that given the flexibility of creating government-specific items and the voluntary nature of the anchor, it is possible that preparers may overuse custom items without anchor, or like the choice is inconsistent among issuers that pose a challenge for the data consumer.
Thank you. Lisa?
Yes, I agree with what was just said about the flexibility, and if it gets too broad, it could diminish the usability of the data. And then also just understanding how things anchor when there is no anchor, what happens, and when there are different relationships other than a one-to-one.
Thank you. Liz?
Nothing additional. Thank you.
Thank you. Amber?
The only additional information I would have is we talked earlier about how you could pick multiple anchors, and Lisa brought up how would those values come over. And I don't really see that I fully understand that. And I just want to make sure that if you can pick multiple anchors, you're still, when you're querying, you're still getting your right dollar amount.
Thank you. Lauren?
Nothing further.
Thank you. Dean?
Further.
Thank you. Triette?
Nothing to add.
Thank you. John?
Nothing further from me.
Thank you. Joseph, Yossi?
Nothing further on that one.
Thank you. Chris?
Nothing further either.
Thank you. Lewis?
Nothing further.
Thank you. Abhishek?
This may be repetitive, but tying back to some of the comments that were made is, so as should we consider a default anchor item like other, right? So anything that is not tagged is being tagged to other, so there's some level of consistency. Is there a protocol for feedback, right? So as you see financials, and if I see financials from certain issuers which are consistently having a lot of custom items, how do I communicate that back to them so that they can adjust it if needed? And if they're, again, like listening to the same feedback from other consumers of that data. And the third is, what sort of protocol do we have in place if issuers do change their categorization over time, right? So as I'm looking at historical data, I want to make sure that now I can reconcile between this year's and the previous year's financials if they've been retagged in some way. So having some sort of mechanism of back and forth would be helpful. And I don't know how you kind of do it in a feasible fashion, like who plays the conduit in this case, but I think that's going to be important.
So from that perspective, I would like to respond. The GASB today does not play that role. So oftentimes people call us users frustrated because there's something up with the set of financial statements and we really don't have a feedback loop to help. If a preparer or an auditor call us and ask us, hey, what do I do with this? Or what do you think of that? Sure, we'll talk to you all day long. But we don't have, I would even call it an authority issue where we call them back and said, hey, our role as a standard setter, not as a regulator, as an oversight or monitoring component. And so that would be very, very difficult for us to even think through those kinds of issues.
Maybe they put a contact us button on MSRB. Yeah.
Right. It's
I'm
like,
just kidding. But I mean, some way to, like, definitely, I think if the idea is to bridge this communication gap between issuers and investors, there should be an easier protocol, right? And I'm not saying it has to be GASB, but I think there are going to be challenges that we as an industry would need to address.
Understood. Thank you. Stephanie?
Nothing to add.
Thank you. Robert?
I have nothing to add.
Thank you, Matt.
Nothing more to add.
Thank you. Hollis?
I would just echo the comment that I think there's going to be issues if one item can be anchored to multiple anchors.
Thank you. Mark?
I think one of the outcomes of this project is to help have better comparability among different organizations. And I think in order to do that, you're going to have some kind of guidelines to help standardize what's going to be in these line items, because from one organization to another, it could vary a lot. And it's not going to help any of the users of the financial data if there's, again, there needs to be some help for organizations to help determine what goes in these line items. Otherwise, it won't be value to anyone. So,
thank you. Carl?
Yeah, I just had the thought that, it's difficult as a board member to kind of weigh these forks in the road, because so many of the balancing we're doing has to do with how are the software implementers going to implement it, how are the preparers going to be educated, and probably other things like are certain states have very common non-standard line items and other states don't, that maybe we could help them steer them in the right direction. So it seems like it can express the GASB concepts well, but a lot of the benefit and optimization lies in the implementation questions and weighing how that's going to play out. So it's difficult.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions or feedback about topic number 2? Nope. So we would be moving forward to topic number 3, pretty much a continuation of the dialogue this morning for the purposes of the board. So I'm going to make it as succinct as I possibly can. We discussed this morning, we provide you with a handout of 49 topics. That is the starting of the design of the note disclosures. With that, we plan to layer in the structure of the design of large block text, discrete block texts, and details. So level 1, 2, and 3 of the blocks as we discuss. We discussed with you that when particularly did the tagging of statement 100 was probably when it caught really the most attention of everybody who was looking at this going, do we really need to do level 1, 2, and 3 for every single note? And then as a result of that, the approach today is we are starting with the level 1 blocks that are defined based on the observed practice. They have been reconciled to the codification and the reporting requirements. And then the question is, what do we do next? And so the approach is we're going to solicit feedback through the discussion memorandum. Then we're going to do additional research with users of financial statements. And then we're going to move forward to start developing the details and granularity and the notes as we receive additional feedback. So with that, question number 7. What feedback do you have about the granularity considerations regarding the block text for notes of financial statements? And I'm going to start to my left, which would be Mark.
I've got to start a lot of these. I thought that the attachment, the items that were included in there were pretty thorough. I would make the request that we don't go any more granular than we have to. And again, that's going to be kind of up to the users to determine what that level of detail is necessary. But I think the further you go, the more work it will create. And I thought keeping it as high a level as possible would be more beneficial for the preparers. So.
Thank you. Lisa?
I think that there's different granularity needs within each of the different notes. And so I think that the approach is a good one.
Thank you. Louis?
So I have a few comments here. So, the first is to understand that the granularity question should be thought of differently for narrative relative to numerical, right? So generally speaking, users want, generally speaking, I know we have exceptions with certain tables and whatnot, but generally speaking, users want more granularity with the numbers because those populate earnings models, whereas narrative does not, for the most part. It's context, it's important, but it doesn't populate the model. And so in many cases, less granularity on narrative is not only okay, but more suitable because you need to see those numbers in the full context of the narrative. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. Don't think of granularity as just the same thing, whether you're talking about numbers or you're talking about narrative. It's really different. The math on that is different. The other question is the specific item that you're thinking about, the narrative item that you're thinking about making more granular, does it even stand alone, stand on its own, right? Or does it really need to be read in context of the full narrative? Sometimes we get carried away with trying to break something down into all of its bits and pieces. And at the end of the day, the reader, the consumer of the data just wants the whole thing anyway. So what benefit do you get going down that path? I think it's really important, given where we are today versus where we were 10 years ago, we have AI now. And everything I just said might be turned on its head in an AI environment because AI can take greater advantage of that granularity and narrative. It's important to talk to folks that are using AI applications to analyze or consume this data, just how much granularity is important to them. I've gotten different answers on that. I've had some tell me it doesn't matter, and I've had some say, oh no, give me more granularity. I don't know the answer to that, but it's an important question to be asking. And then I would say, at the end of the day, because you've got plenty of runway ahead of you, start simple. You can always, as I said this morning, you can always add, but it's much harder to take away. I know there's different views on that, but from my perspective and what we've done with the FASB gap taxonomy, we have more text blocks than we need, and getting rid of them is harder than adding them. So those are my thoughts. I hope I answered the right question.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Thank you. Hollis?
I think it'll be important to continue to keep fresh in your mind as you continue to have these conversations that it's not the essentiality conversation. It's a different conversation. Like Louis pointed out, you want to make sure that numbers aren't taken out of context. So more granularity could, in certain situations, actually provide less decision useful information. And to your question earlier, Jeff, about what parts of this process are going to create, like, where is the cost benefit in the project? I think this is where it is. The more detailed the tagging is in the notes to the financial statements, the more costly it'll be. So you'll just have to continue to do that cost benefit analysis as you look at each disclosure individually.
Thank you. Triet?
Yeah, I actually agree with most of what Louis said in terms of different sections of say we're talking about the notes. Different sections probably have different analytical importance, right? So we need to have that kind of feedback from the users to see, okay, obviously you want as much granularity as you can get about the pension liabilities, but maybe not so much about some other items. So I think that's really where we need a lot more user feedback.
Thank you. Amber?
I think that as long as I can keep my notes the same, and I think most governments would feel this way, that the granularity would be okay. But we talked about earlier how some large governments might take 20 to 30 notes to achieve the same objective that I might take 10 notes to. So for instance, with pensions, I put my deferred outflows and deferred inflows in the same note. In this inventory of topics, we have 49 different topics. So as long as we're communicating that if you address 2 of these topics in one note, you don't have to go build a different note structure for the taxonomy, I think that will be okay.
Thank you. Robert?
Yeah, much the same as what Lisa said. I think the different levels of need to for the detail is going to be varied between the different notes. I'm concerned again about the small users being able to not be overburdened with what they need to the additional work they may need to do there.
Thank you. Carl?
I have nothing to add.
Thank you. Shu?
A layer approach makes sense. As many of us mentioned, some narrative policy level topics need less granularity than those quantitative topics. And also granularity should be driven by the user's need. For example, some high impact notes or any high analyst, investor, or rating agency usage notes like the pension, OPEB, long-term liabilities definitely requires more granularities. Those are the areas that add value. And so for some of the narrative part, maybe the level 1 block is sufficient.
Thank you. Campbell?
Yeah, I'm fine with the approach.
Thank you. Stephanie?
I agree with the approach too. I think one thing I want to reiterate is just sort of the danger of going very granular and decontextualizing and not having the appropriate meaning around the data. And to that effect too, I mean, within the context of a note itself, but also in connection back to the face financial statements. I mean, as I mentioned before, I really like the idea that you can sort of connect, I see this number on the face financial statement, and I know that there's a note that corresponds to it that gives me additional information. So I need to look at those things together.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, I have a harder time just figuring out tagging data when it comes to a note than I do financial statements. Just again, I'm a visual person trying to see it all. And some of our notes vary so much. So I like Lewis's, idea of starting simpler with the notes and adding on later to more complex things needed. And as she was saying too, like focusing on those areas where we know the users really have a need. They need to see our pension, OPEB, that whatever related data as the higher priority ones.
Thank you. Abhishek?
Yeah, pretty much in line with what everyone said so far. I'm still, to your point, Chris, it's like visually how this data is saved, right? Like if I think from the perspective of it's a blob of text and then it's a table with some hierarchy maintained, right? Is that all going to be saved as like one JSON file, for example, right? Right. That's important, just so that I understand what the value on the consumer end is. Because if the issuer says, hey, you know what, like too much granularity in tagging, it's a huge manual effort. But if I could get a categorization on saying, hey, this is the long-term debt part of the notes or the financials, right? That level of tagging itself on block one, as long as I know how the data is structured, would be very helpful. Because on our side, we can then figure out, like talking to all the data vendors is breaking that data after that is much easier, right? We just need to know how this data is being saved.
Thank you. Matt?
I agree with the approach that's being taken. I personally think that from everything that I've seen so far, this is the most difficult aspect of kind of what's going on here. And the example that comes to mind for me would be, and I'm beating this horse dead again, pension and OPEB expense. So pension and OPEB expense, they're not a line item on the financial statements. They're usually wedged in between tables of information within the notes, but it's usually as part of a block of text. It said, we recognize pension expense of X. So how dealing with something like that's a very important piece of information, but it doesn't neatly fit into any of these other boxes. That's just one example of why I think this one's really difficult.
I think actually, funny enough, I think that one is a straightforward one. You just take one little block out. Thank you. Lauren?
I think what Amber said is going to be important, that it's not going to be restructuring what they already have in there. I think the example I talked about earlier is leases. Like they might have their lessor leases in the receivable section, and they might have their lessee leases in the long-term debt section. And so they don't have to go restructure their entire footnotes that are already there. They can work with what they have.
Thank you. Yossi?
I think the approach is great. I think starting with the broad text blocks and then cherry picking the information that's detailed and granular but has meaning without context. I'm just looking at a public filing here. It's the FASB side of the house, but you've got, an effective tax rate. Well, that has meaning without context. Maybe that gets tagged, and then something else where you've got the incremental commitment on some particular acquisition. That doesn't mean anything outside of the paragraph. The one other thing I would add is outside of numbers, I think personally, one of my favorites is the listing of blended component units, discrete component units. That might be something where there's some text that you might want to have a little bit of additional granularity. You've got the reporting entity, but maybe let me get that listing of the blended component units. Let me get that listing of the discrete. There may be examples like that, to look out for.
Thank you. Liz?
Yes, I really like the approach of the 3 levels. I think in terms of narrative, the level 1 data or tagging is going to be really helpful. Just simply tagging an entire note. I don't generally feel like needing like subcomponents of a note at the level 1 level. In fact, a lot of, say, paragraphs or sections of a note are related to each other, so it might be even hard to parse it more in a more refined way than just at the level of the note itself. So I have a lot of value for level 1. I have a lot of value for level 3 in certain places, like the capital assets table, for example, where you want every piece of it. Where I'm not quite so sure is the value of level 2, where you're just gonna, essentially draw a box around an entire table, because if I'm in a fully, automated environment and there's level 3 data there, then I can take that data and rebuild the entire table if I want to in my own analytic tool, or parse it however I want to in my own analytic tool, but I don't need the level 2 at all, right? And if I'm not in a automated environment, then having, again, a box around that table, it doesn't really help me, do too much that I can't do manually. So, and I don't know if eliminating level 2 even saves any time, but I have less value for level 2 than levels 1 and 3. And again, level 3 needs to be selective, because that's a lot of additional work. But level 3 can exist as a table like the capital assets table, or embedded in the narrative of the pension and OPEB section. For example, in the middle of a sentence, you might have one number you want to have level 3 detail on. So I think level 2 is something probably I would be interested in a little more thought around the use case and value for level 2.
Thank you. So before I go to question 8, does anybody have any additional thoughts or feedback? Oh, the virtual people, give me a minute. So John, question 7.
I like the approach you're taking here, and to echo everything everybody's been saying about users. I think that's going to be the driving consideration in terms of the granularity, in terms of level 3 tagging, and what's important in the context of the financial statements and the notes that users need to extract to be able to consume and leverage in terms of their analysis.
Thank you. Dean?
I just want to add that detailed or defined granularity creates the opportunity to automate data quality validation. So the granularity may be useful to the reporting entities if they can act as libraries that will provide evidence, compliance, or data quality. So don't think it's only about the data consumers and data reporters.
Thank you. Jeff?
So while I have everybody here, I figure I'd take advantage of your knowledge to help me out as I think about this thing, because it looks like you have the 49 groups of disclosures and the 100 and whatever different disclosures that are involved. And it, we're sort of talking about, well, let's let the users decide. Let's talk to the users about what level of granularity. And when I think about, I'm sort of tossing in my head this cost and burden, and I understand that, if you level 3'd everything, right, the governments would be working all day long, and we don't want that. And level 1 everything, well, that's easier for the governments, but maybe the users wouldn't get the full value out of the information. But if we now take this long list of things and we say, well, 27 of them are done this way, and 16 of them are done at level 1, and 14 of them are done at level 1 and 2, and 17 are done at level 1, 2, and 3. Is that a form of complexity now that we're bringing into the model, right? That are we all saying, yeah, that's a level of complexity we think we can, this is where I'm relying on your expertise, like we think we would get to know that, we'd have to slog through it at the beginning, but people would figure it out. Or is it always going to be like, wow, and I'm just comparing it to the two ends of the spectrum, right? If everything was one way or everything was the other way, there might be some burden involved, but there wouldn't be this complexity of now I have to think through every note that I'm doing and I got to do it a different way. And is that going to be rife for error? Am I going to start to, I thought that was note 16, it was note 15. You know what I mean? I don't know how this information will be imparted to governments, but I'm just thinking about, as I think about that decision, like, wow, how do I think about this? Is there a savings in complexity of having it? And maybe we can't get there, and maybe for other reasons, I'll get to that other point.
but I want to think about how much of a burden do people think that aspect, because when people tend to talk about it, we all tend to think about it as, well, it's one way or the other, right? Like, what do I think's better, 1 or 3? And what if it's very often granular note by note, right? And somebody's going to have to understand note by note, this is how you tag, and is that going to be too complex for people to absorb?
Louis?
So we deal with that problem all the time. And, well, maybe not all the time, but enough. And sometimes the simpler answer is the less elegant answer. Providing preparers too many choices adds complexity. There's no question about that. And so we have frequently made choices that aren't what we like from an architectural perspective, but they're easier to deal with, because every time we say we've got to work around for this, we've got to work around that. Every time we add a choice, we're adding complexity. And so we try to keep that as simple as much as we can.
Abhishek?
It may be more of a question from me, but I think a lot of that depends on at what level is this tagging happening, right? So if I think from, again, a software cycle, right? A lot of this data, if I look at, let's say, notes of the financials is the table on debt or investments, that's saved somewhere in a database, which is being extracted to then incorporate in a PDF, right? So if the data as exists in whatever database it is, like the cash management or treasury management system of the issuer, and if it's already tagged there, extracting that and tagging that in the disclosure should be easier. Unlike it's not tagged there, so you have to export it out as a preparer, incorporate it in the format that you're trying to disclose it, and then tag it out there, where it becomes more complex to maintain. So maybe, out there they just do level 1 tagging because they can't go granular out there. And again, I don't know the answer. I'm just kind of thinking out loud if that's what creates that complexity. And the more these downstream applications where the core data for the preparer exists is better tagged, the easier it gets upstream as it makes it part of the disclosures.
I was just going to add, though, as a preparer for the state, my data is not in one system. It's coming from my treasury system, my CPA reports, my agencies that aren't on the central treasury system. So it's not in one database ever. So
that does make it, yeah.
Amber?
I think it's a good thought, but I don't know if it would really work or if it would add too many more uncertainties. Like if one government added a lot more information in one of these sections than most, they might say, well, I need level 1, 2, and 3, but because most only have a paragraph with one number to tag, then they're only going to have that level 1. And if we don't offer level 2 and level 3, I think some of those governments are going to say, well, now what do I do? Because I'm not really getting the information that was meant to get here, just because they want to put it in a table and, all those kind of things.
Lisa?
So I have to commend Jeff for making what I thought was a concession, a complexity, right? So we don't need that much granularity in certain notes because, it's just too time consuming. But I agree that it does add like this kind of, what do I do with this note? I wonder whether or not there needs to be, when you go through the user process, do we need to think about how useful is it has to meet a higher standard of usefulness in order for it to move from just a level 1 box to maybe, going down to level, and maybe it's just a level 3, from Liz's point before, but maybe we don't. Yeah, I think that maybe we need to kind of think about it as a higher threshold level if we're going to start to think about kind of bifurcating the road of notes.
Thank you. Hollis?
I think the complexity that I'm struggling to think through when I think about operationalizing this is when I think about the face of the financial statements, you're going line by line and every line needs a tag. And when you're thinking about level 1, like, okay, my summary of significant accounting policies has a tag. Cash and investments has a tag. But once we get into level 3, it seems like you have to flip the way you're thinking about it, and you're not going through and tagging each item. You're looking at a list of, pension expense, discount rate, and you're trying to find those things in the statement. So it seems like it's like a reverse way of thinking. And I think that that's, to me, where it starts to feel complex when I think about actually going through and tagging an ACFR.
Matt?
Yeah, I don't have an answer for you, Jeff, but this gets at why I think this is one of the most difficult things that we're faced with, because, right, I mean, the easiest thing, an easier thing to do would be to say, okay, everything is going to be level 1, or everything is going to be level 2, or everything is going to be level 3. And those might not be appropriate for every note. On the other hand, reaching out to users and trying to figure out note by note, what do you need the most detail on, and then compiling a list of that, that's going to be really, really difficult too. So again, I don't have an answer for you, but you did a better job of getting at why I think this is one of the most difficult things you guys are facing.
Great. Any other comments? So I think in question number 8, the way it's posed is essentially what feedback do you have about engaging users to formulate this? And I think broadly speaking, the vast majority of you have said, yeah, we think you should talk to users. So maybe let's flip the conversation a little bit, and I'll open up, since I didn't give you the question in advance. But how do we do it? I mean, Matt has asked this question since we started the conversation. So how are you going to get a user to engage with you and ask them to forward thinking about a data set that they don't have today? How are they going to think about what to do? I mean, how are we going to engage in this conversation? How do I sit in front of the next user who has never seen a taxonomy, who consumes data from either a database or a PDF? And how do I tell him, what are those things do you put in your forecasting model and your revenue projection model? And how do you analyze your credit? How do I help them understand what the information that we're seeking? Because that's what we need, right? I mean, we need to understand that you take all your capital asset note information, the tables, and you put it somewhere in a database, and then you run your capital asset analysis, or you run your long-term note disclosure analysis. You do that. How do I explain that to a user to be able to engage with something they have never seen before? Liz? And I will not call on you because I didn't pose it in advance, so on a volunteer only basis. So feel free to raise your hand if you want to respond.
Yes, I think there's a few ways to get some of that feedback. I mean, one is to ask users, like, what specific data points they extract from the face of the financial statements and not from the face of the financial statements. You can ask them just, confidentially, if they'll share their template, right? What are the things that are in your template that you're collecting? If you look at rating agency methodologies, they tell you exactly what they're going to look at. They say, here's the ratios we calculate. Okay, well, are the components of those ratios in the taxonomy? Because you need those components in order to calculate the ratios. They also talk about the qualitative factors that they look at, and if those qualitative factors are something that are covered in, say, the narrative and the notes to the financial statements, that would be a signal that it's going to be valued in a taxonomy. And then you can ask them, like, what are the non-numeric things that you look for in the notes? So they may look for certain things like subsequent events. Is there a pension, right? Well, if you've tagged the note that says pension, you can query everything and say, how many of them have a note called pension? And narrow down their analysis that way. So I think there's a few very specific things you can ask people about the way that they use this information, and get more granular feedback from them about what they actually need to use.
Thank you. Abhishek?
Liz covered a lot, and I was going to just go through that list, right? So obviously, like a lot of us are part of the NFMA, and it's the largest analytical, group of buy side or sell side analysts. We have the FDTA working committee, and I spoke to Jeff about it. We're trying to transform that into more digital reporting, just in line with how GASB is thinking about it. So engaging that group definitely would be helpful to get a broader set of users out there through webinars to understand, how they think about this data, understanding your methodology. Paulina, you've presented in the past to the group, so that would be a great way to collect feedback. We're in the process of writing certain opinion papers out there. I was going to say, like, I've worked with every major data vendor in this space in the past, and they have a huge amount of intel based on what kind of feedback they're getting from the market itself. So definitely engaging. Most of their data or templates are at least public, or they publicly share it. So that would be a great way to kind of get access to the data. Rating agencies, Liz mentioned it. Also the large entities. So at Assured Guarantee, we're, as I've said, like 7,000 entities that we have exposure to any given point of time, and we look at 2,500 credits every year. So that's a huge volume of data that we rinse and repeat through. So we have a group of 30, 40 analysts that you can engage with. I'm sure there are other larger mutual funds and buy-side asset managers that you could engage with as well.
Thank you. Lisa?
Yeah, most of it's now been covered. And that's okay. The other thing I would maybe think about, and I don't know exactly how you do it, and maybe it's a phase 2, but it would be, I think, me personally, I like to see things and be able to use them. And so if there was even a flat demo where, you had a couple of issuers that were put in there and presented in 2 different ways, and you could kind of see how that information could be utilized and presented, that could be really helpful for getting people to kind of visualize how to use the data.
Thank you. Matt?
I actually don't think this might be as difficult maybe as it seems on the surface. I think a lot of the difficulty is really going to be around the terminology of what is a taxonomy and just trying to understand exactly, because again, I'd never heard about any of this before. But every analyst is already using a database of one form or another. We use Credit Scope. I think that would be the one that most folks are using. So I think one of the ways to get at it is, the potential for this is to create a more comprehensive database than anything that's out there currently. So to ask, if you had that comprehensive database, how would you use it? How would you change the models that you are already using? So again, I think folks are already using a database. They're using models in one form or another. The potential of this project is the potential for a database that's more comprehensive than anything that's out there right now.
Thank you. Lauren?
I know you talked about engaging the users, but also just asking the preparers. I think that would also maybe give them some incentive to buy into the voluntary framework, saying, hey, our bondholders or whoever's always asking us for this one specific number. Every single call we have with them, they want to know what this number is. And so maybe asking the preparers what they're getting asked. If Amber's always getting a FOIA request every year for the exact same number, maybe getting some feedback from that, just asking the preparers what they're getting asked for.
Thank you. Stephanie?
I think from the user point of view too, one thing I want to keep in mind is there's going to be specific data points and notes that are going to be very important from like the investor community, which I think is the main users of the data. But from a research point of view, that's a little bit broader in academic research. We're looking at all kinds of different things and maybe you're interested in different data points. So I think, what's important to us is this kind of nested structure that if everything has a level 1 tag, right, we at least have a place to start. And we may have tools and capabilities, as Liz said, like we don't need further tagging because if we can kind of ingest that level 1, we may have tools that can like recreate the tables and identify the data points that we need. So I think from that point of view, just kind of keeping an open mind about different types of data that may be important to different stakeholder groups and the tools that we already have to kind of identify and recognizing that if everything has at least a level 1 tag, we've got, much more of a head start than where we're working with right now.
Thank you. Louis?
So, I'm already really impressed with the level of user engagement that you have. If I contrast that to where we were in the beginning, nobody could even spell XBRL, much less understand digital reporting. So, you really are at a much better place. You've got the experience of, all the digital reporting that's out there. But having said that, the biggest challenge that we experienced was that folks, their response was, well, come back to me with your questions after you've got some data, right? It's hard for me to comment on something we don't have, right? So that's still, it probably remains a core issue, but I still think there's some macro sort of questions you can ask to get at, how do they use the information they get today? And they do have digital platforms they use today. So it's vastly different than what it was 20 years ago. So I think there's a lot you can do there. So I would continue to drill in on that. But I would also be mindful, at least again, from our constituent perspective, there's two core groups of users. There's the end user who really doesn't care where they get their information from, as long as they get it. And then there's the data aggregators. And the data aggregators tend to be our primary, quote unquote, customers, if you will, because they're the closest to the digital information at that point. So I would make sure that you're, pulling them in, folks like Bloomberg and so forth.
Thank you.
And I failed to mention, you've got a vast world of users on the public company side. And by analogy, they can tell you what they think is important. And so I wouldn't ignore that population, even though they might not be using the government data.
Thank you. Amber?
So when I thought about this question, I thought about it differently. I thought about engaging users of the taxonomy that we're putting out, which would make us preparers the user. And I think that you have to engage every user or stakeholder that's coming to the table to make this successful. But because it's voluntary, I do still think that the preparers are going to be hesitant if they think it's going to put a burden on them or a workload. Or I think there's just going to be some preparers that don't even understand it. So they're going to have to learn it. Just like when you implement a GASB standard, you have to learn it, you have to read it, and that's going to take time. So I think in order to engage all users, you have to let every party know how this is going to benefit them, what end results they'll see, how they're going to get there. But otherwise, if you don't engage all users, then all the work to me is for nothing.
Thank you. Hollis?
I think it'll be critical to be very clear about what your question is. Your question is not what data do you use? Your question is what data would you use outside of the context of this disclosure? Would this tidbit of information be valuable to you without also going and reading the disclosure?
Thank you. I think there's a tent in the corner, but I can't see who that is. Thank you.
Actually, this is a little bit off topic, but I've heard a lot about the taxonomy and all of the wording and how we're going to have to educate. And I was thinking, and Amber, you might have said this earlier, that maybe it's really, if we can analogize this to a data conversion process from paper to electronic, like that kind of makes that it much more, everyone's done a data conversion in their lives, right? We've all gone through system changes. And maybe that's a way to kind of think about this. We're not really developing, because you're not developing anything new here, right? You're just converting the data from the paper GASB statement to an electronic GASB statement. So maybe that's a way to make it more approachable.
Thank you. Unless anybody, yes, ma'am.
Sorry, I had totally lost my train of thought of where I meant to go a while ago. So where I meant to go with the preparer is I think we want to engage them to get their feedback up front because eventually this is going to be mandated upon us. I mean, the Federal Data Transparency Act, they're in the process of trying to build their taxonomy and such. And if we beat them to that, then maybe they would look at us as, oh, well, this is great. So why reinvent the wheel? So I do think sooner rather than later, this is going to be forced upon the preparers in the room. So I think one way to engage them is let them know if they're giving their feedback, they can help mold the process.
Thank you very much. I think that gets us to question number 8, unless anybody else has last comments. And the only last topic is, as I mentioned this morning, the discussion memorandum, the communication style. We've talked about the challenges. We think, at least in this small group of people, which is not small at all, have already begun to learn a language and a communication style that we can talk among each other and still get somewhere. But it has taken us at least 3 iterations of a long, very long time to get us there. Any suggestions, feedback, recommendations that you may have as we engage, as Amber is discussing, not only the preparers, but the auditors, the users, the taxonomists, the technologies, the data aggregators, so they can understand. And a single document is a very challenging issue because of the varying audience. So any feedback, suggestions, or recommendations you can provide. I also will not be calling upon you in this question, so please put your tent up and feel free to offer your recommendations. Matt.
I think you guys are good about this already, but I would say just get out on the conference circuit as much as you can, because I'm continually surprised, I would say, by how often I talk to analysts who aren't aware of some of the major changes that are going on at the GASB. We aren't always as attentive as we should be. But one of the ways to do that, again, if you can be on a panel at an NFMA conference or something, do that. Just do whatever you can to get the word out that this is a thing that we're doing. You should be paying attention to it, and we're looking for your feedback.
Thank you. Abhishek?
I know we discussed it earlier. I just wanted to make sure that with the DM, if sample data can be released, that would be helpful. And I know it's a challenging thing, but I think it's just, the faster we can start visualizing this data and like contextualizing it, it'll be helpful to provide, much more seamless feedback. And I know I'm sorry. It comes
No, certainly appreciate the comment. And at this stage, we will release the taxonomy file, but data we plan to start working through in the next iteration when it's a little more complete and the decisions are a little more solid. Carl, Amber.
Depending on how detailed the discussion memorandum gets with technical wording, maybe a glossary of terms would be helpful, because I know at lunch I was talking with the group and I said, well, I still don't even know what LLM means. And it had been said multiple times. But when you're targeting, preparers of financial statements, but you're using all this technical terms, just a quick glossary could be helpful.
Thank you, ma'am. Robert?
And another lunch conversation that I think that plays into this would be making sure that the big picture is explained as part of that discussion memorandum. In my understanding it was the boundaries of this was just those things that is under GASB's control, and I know that later steps are, the plan is to broaden it to the audit opinion and reports and to statistical tables in it, so that the entire act for, if those things are going to be included with either partners or the GASB themselves, that is discussed to some degree, so that the broad user community and those preparing see benefit. If I'm preparing an ACFR and it's not going to cover all aspects of it, then what's that going to do for me?
And I appreciate that feedback very deeply. And it's a very balancing act, because at the moment we're undertaking it only as GASB with a voluntary framework. And so that's why in the initial development of the scope is how we had defined what GASB prescribed. But even the first question that Liz posed, I thought it was fantastic. What are you going to do with identifiers? Yes. It's a yes answer, right? And then you have to think about the audit report. And then you think about if somebody wants to do the CFA, if somebody wants to do the, and so those kinds of things are certainly things that it's not like we're not thinking about it, but we're trying to be mindful of how do we start even the discussion. I think it's a big lift to even get everybody on board to the gap component, than to think about the entire book cover to cover. So definitely appreciate the feedback. Just understand that there's some challenges in the communication there. Carl.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on something Matt said, and it's almost like that on the preparer side, where I think they see the least upside to this project. The people maybe they need to hear from are people like Liz and Matt, because a preparer might think their customer is their boss who thinks Act First should have been out last week, when in fact it's, this is who the customer is, and having that understanding of an exposure to how the data is going to be used in a real world context might be get more buy-in and appreciation of the value of this work.
Thank you. Louis.
I would hope the discussion document would spend a sufficient amount of time talking about the value proposition. It's really easy to get into a technical document and explain why we're doing it this way or that way, but you're going to have some resistance. And so it's really important to explain and describe why this is valuable for this reporting supply chain and that everybody benefits from it, however way you can do that.
Thank you. Stephanie?
I think the other thing too, and Paulina, you mentioned this earlier, is really emphasizing the point of this is an iterative process. This isn't, we need to contemplate every last, strange, particular unique case at this point in time, that this is something that is going to be a first draft, and then it's going to be, it's going to be a living thing. And so I think that's maybe a different mindset than people are used to consuming information from the GASB.
Thank you. Lisa?
So I'm going to put Louis on the spot. Is there something that can be borrowed from the FASB about where you were and where you are today and the benefits that have accrued from converting from paper documents to?
How much time do you have?
Okay. No, but I mean, if there's a way to kind of show that could be.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have so many slides. We have so much. There's plenty of narrative that we could provide to help with that. Yes.
Lisa, one of the things that's going to be tricky for us is Lewis had the advantage of the SEC mandate, which we don't have. And so part of us, and Lewis is right, it's a marketing doc, but part of us is convincing folks, especially the preparer community, why they want to engage in that activity and explain them why it's helpful for the user community to engage in that activity. You have to sell it, which is very different than someone's mandated you have to do it and then you just have to explain what you have to do. It's still, there's still a marketing aspect of that, but it's a different marketing aspect, if that makes sense, right? So we've got to really explain to people why they would want to voluntarily, words in the title, why they want to voluntarily do this.
Right. I was just wondering if there was anything that came out of that that would be good for that marketing material. Yeah, no, I hear you. We're always kind of fighting why.
Great. A lot of good feedback. Any last comments, questions, concerns, considerations, or confessions? None. Really, really appreciate all the conversation all day. Thank you so much for your time. It's been extremely valuable to all of us, including the board and particularly the staff and the team. So thank you again for all the time you put into this. With that, we're done.